chair this final session on education and youth needs and rights. And I'm going to, just as the previous sessions, 15 minutes for each speaker, questions at the end. And we're going to go right into it. I'm not going to take any of the speakers' time. Rather just introduce the first speaker, Maria Omer Atali, from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem School of Education and the center.
Hi, everyone. What about some more challenges regarding systematic problems about children? My name is Maria Omeratali, and I'm a doctoral student at the School of Education here at the UPenn University. And today I would like to talk about student participation in schools. The children have the right to participate in decision-making processes that affect them has been around for a quarter of a century. Yet, schools barely implemented this principle into their culture and daily practices. My talk today will focus on an initiative that seems to have the potential to create the opportunity for student participation in schools, but fails to meet these expectations. I'll start by discussing the general concept of children's right to participate and its implementation in schools. Then I'll describe the initiative and share my initial findings about the barriers it faces. These insights might shed light on the broader challenges of student participation in schools. Ronnie was right.
Ronnie is
always
always the
right.
conclusion. אז
Okay.
פשוט ככה, אני משאירה לך את העכבר.
Okay, it works. One of the UNCRC's most groundbreaking contribution to children's rights discourse is recognizing children's right to participate in decision-making processes that affect them. Participation includes sharing one's view, being heard, and having one's view given due weight. Schools are where children spend most of their time and are expected to develop critical skills like self-expression, problem-solving, and teamwork. Research even shows that student participation helps drive school improvements. However, in most schools, participation is minimal, tokenistic, framed, and disconnected from daily routines and policies. Why is this the case? Research points to several reasons, like lack of awareness among educators about the importance of participation, skepticism about students' ability to contribute meaningfully, and teachers' focus on maintaining order and discipline. The initiative I've explored aims to transform schools into continuous learning and improvement institutions. It's a collaboration between a social impact company, two national education organizations, and philanthropy. While the initiative doesn't explicitly aim to promote student participation, the components are there. Students' voices are collected, discussed, and used to make decisions regarding issues that may impact their learning and school experience. How it works. Teachers or schools select a topic for improvement. They choose a relevant short survey from a digital library and send it to students via link on WhatsApp. Students complete a survey in class, and teachers receive an instant summary of the results. The teacher also receives a presentation through which he can present the results in class and discuss them with the students. Based on the findings, an intervention is planned, implemented, and reassessed in a new cycle. That's an improvement cycle. In addition, the education organizations provide coaching to the schools to support this process. In my research, I'm using this initiative as a case study to explore the opportunities and limitations for students to participate in schools, and what happens when an initiative like this one offers more significant opportunities for fostering student voices and participation. I do that through interviewing students, teachers, principals, coaches, and the designers of the initiative. I also observe lessons, teacher meetings, and other relevant gatherings, some of which are documented in video. The interviews are analyzed thematically, and the observations are analyzed using ethnographic methods. Over the 16 months I have explored this initiative, I have found that students have rarely been included in the improvement cycles beyond filling out surveys or occasionally discussing the results. Potentially, students could have taken part in all phases of the improvement cycle. In practice, this is how small the students' part in the decision-making process is. It is not by mistake that the students' part and the two phases that supposedly involve the students are not entirely overlapping. It represents some issues with the surveys, the way they are presented or not presented, the process of completing them, and other problems common in these phases that limit participation. Due to lack of time, I won't discuss this limitation in detail, but I would like to share a short story demonstrating this gap. As part of the research, I'm visiting an elementary school. I observed fourth graders completing a survey, and a few days later, when the teacher showed them the presentation, I came to observe them again. Before the presentation started, the teacher explained that she chose a survey about empathy, and she thinks it's necessary and lacking in their classroom. However, she then presented a whole presentation that had nothing to do with empathy. It was a presentation about hopes and dreams for the future. I asked the student next to me if these questions were familiar, and he approved. None of the students said a word, and the teacher didn't blink an eye either. Later, I discovered that the teacher shared with them the presentation of her class from the previous year. They were not asked the questions shown in the presentation, and their results were not theirs. This story demonstrates how far the tokenistic ritual of discussing the results with the students can go. This is one example of the limitations on student participation in this context. Now I would like to share with you some key themes that explain why this initiative, despite its potential struggles to foster student participation, truly. Participation is about sharing different voices. It's about engaging with diverse perspectives in open dialogue. But in this initiative, the language is all about data. Schools are encouraged to learn from data to improve. One principal summed up the prevailing mindset saying, "In my organization, we believe the more data-driven the decision-making process is, the more accurate it will be." Here's an example of a survey statement result from a summary a teacher receives after her students complete a survey. For individual teachers, and only for individual teachers, it is possible to include responses to open-ended questions, typically there's one in every survey, from specific students in the data summary. However, when the results are analyzed at a team or school level, which is more common, the distinction between different groups of children and individual students' unique experiences and perspectives may be excluded and overlooked. Now, don't get me wrong, data is valuable. But when we reduce student feedback to data points, we risk turning their voices into checkbox exercise. Instead of empowering students, we turn them into passive providers of statistics. Let's discuss the initiative's stakeholders and context. The initiative was developed by 3 organizations, 2 of which have significant influence over the participating schools. Combine that with the bureaucratic nature of the Israeli education system, and you get a process that feels more like top-down monitoring than a collaborative improvement effort. For many school leaders, taking part in this initiative is less about fostering engagement and more about managing accountability. One principal admitted his main reason for joining was to address concerns about his school, low scores on the National Climate Survey. When framed this way, as a top-down requirement, it's no wonder this initiative doesn't spark meaningful engagement. In these circumstances, assessment is associated with and might be used as an accountability tool rather than an improvement mechanism. The structural issues also permeate the perceptions of both teachers and students regarding this initiative. Teachers often see it as another external demand, not an opportunity for growth. One teacher shared that she doesn't trust the anonymity of school surveys and believes responses can always be tracked back. Because of this, she personally either avoids participating or writes what she thinks the administration wants to hear. And what about students? Regardless of this initiative, many don't see their schools as places open to change or willing to listen. They view decisions as dictated by the Ministry of Education, not even by their schools or teachers, leaving little room, if any, for their voices. Here are some of their words. "It's not the school's decision, it's the Ministry of Education. It doesn't matter what we say, it won't change anything. You can't really change it. These are things the schools decide on." Participation requires a sense of belonging, that one matters, and that one can make a difference. Teachers have reported a sense of disconnection and apathy among their students. And students They compare the school experiences unfavorably to other settings like youth movement, work, or home. T, a high school teacher, described it perfectly. I just love this quote. In the deeper sense, it's like it's not their place. Like they're here in something that was created for them, but they're not partners in building it. To me, that's the heart of all the challenges in schools. The extreme alienation students feel from the system. That's the story. It's like we're constantly struggling with this discipline issue, and we keep trying to solve it saying, let's be strict, let's enforce the rules, let's focus on this, on the code of conduct, let's do this and that. But it doesn't come out of nowhere. This difficulty with discipline, it stems from students feeling deeply alienated, the same way any of us would feel if we were part of a place where we had absolutely no influence. This teacher, T, told me about a project in her school, not related to this initiative, that included roundtables of teachers and students rethinking an issue in the school. She was surprised to see the teachers guiding the students as facilitators rather than sharing thoughts with them as part of a dialogic discussion. Again, this proves how foreign participation is to the usual school conduct and the typical relationships between teachers and students. And here's a student perspective. I feel more comfortable there in the Scouts because they pay more attention to me and I have more room to make an impact. Here I'm just a student, but there I'm a counselor. I have more responsibility and I can make a lot more decisions. I have more space. Finally, yes, I said the word finally. Participation takes time and attention, resources many teachers simply don't have. They're juggling urgent tasks and tight schedules, leaving little room for improvement cycles, let alone involving students in them. I remember attending a teacher meeting early in this initiative. There were about a dozen math and science teachers gathered in a room. The school administration was also there. The school's initiative coordinator began explaining the improvement cycle, but it was just one topic on an already packed agenda. As she spoke, the teacher grew visibly frustrated, overwhelmed by the additional workload. Sensing this, she eventually said something along the lines of, I'll just send you the link, send it to your students, and that's it. No space for student participation can be created when you minimize disruption for already overburdened teachers. So, where does this leave us? Student participation is essential for meaningful schooling experience. It fosters engagement, builds skills, and can transform school culture, climate, and performance. But participation also requires time, motivation from all involved, and great effort. But it is so foreign to how schools operate. At this stage of my research, I'm left wondering how we can balance the system demands and constraints with the need for authentic participation. While I don't have all the answers yet, I'm committed to exploring solutions. I'm not hopeless, but I cannot offer hope just yet. Before I end, I would like to thank my supervisors, Adam and Tali, for the guidance and encouragement. I'm also grateful to Dr. Yael Becher, which is not here, the Azrieli Foundation, the Center for the Study of Pedagogy, and the Child and Youth Rights Program, of course, for supporting my academic journey. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Moria. I want to thank you for, first and foremost, for the content, but also for being under time. Let that be an example to everyone. And I have the pleasure of inviting Professor Ayelet Becher-Prigat and Professor Pamela Laufer-Yukeles for the next talk on a right to post-majority education.
Well, thank you very much to the organizers for having us here and for all of you who have stayed to listen to our presentations. We are very much still working on our project, and so we'd love our feedback. Your feedback, even if you can't give it now, you can find us and please tell us what you think or suggestions. Okay, so our project is on the concept of post-majority education, and no, how do I make this move? Okay, good. And the first question we asked is, what does the right to education entail? What is its purpose? Why does there are multiple theories and focuses regarding what the right to education entails. In particular, we highlight Susan Muller-Okens and Joel Feinberg's emphasis on the need for education to ensure children's open future, because even if the state is willing to accept vast parental diversity, ultimately the state wants to preserve children's right to make their own decisions as adults. And I quote, "Exit is a bedrock liberal value. It stands for the right to withdraw or refuse to engage. It is the ability to disassociate, to cut oneself out of a relationship with other persons. The ability to exit is emphasized not only to preserve the children's ability to make informed choices as adults, but also in order to allow them to form new relationships. The basis of the right to education is not simply a present right. It is a precondition to a future right to exit one's parental communities and to make informed decisions about one's own well-being and ensure emotional and financial stability in adulthood. It is about participation in the republic, in democracy. It involves a requirement to provide minimum requirements for basic capacity as adults." So we ask the hard questions. Is the right to education being met in 3 test cases that we have thought about, but this is not a closed group. We're still talking. Particularly in the Haredi and Amish education, it is fundamental to their way of life. It is part of the nature of the community. But ultimately, they may not provide certain skills that allow people to participate in community life and in democracy, the language or math skills. And we also talk about homeschooled children who may succeed in integrating, but it must be kept in mind that there can also be significant gaps because it is difficult to provide oversight, and there may not be truly practical way to ensure standards and to supervise what is being taught. Other populations may also be relevant. Ultimately, what we are saying is there are gaps in education that would allow for children to have an open future, and we ask the question, what should we do about it? Should there be coercion? How much coercion? What should be coerced? What compulsory education should exist? And that's the questions that we're grappling with. But we also want to keep front and center that children also have privacy rights or the freedom to be free of state intrusion. Such rights include the child's right to be raised by his or her parents without the state interfering or claiming rights over children. This line of thinking about children's right is clearly represented in the CRC. In Article 5, the CRC provides state parties shall respect the responsibilities, rights, and duties of parents to provide appropriate direction and guidance in the exercise by the child of the rights recognized by the Convention. Additionally, Article 7 continues by explaining that every child has the right to know and be cared for by his or her parents. In Article 14, the CRC states that state parties shall respect the rights and duties of the parents and, when applicable, legal guardians to provide direction to the child in their exercise of their rights. While parents also have a corresponding right to privacy in the United States and some rights, that's not what I'm focusing on here. I'm talking about the children's right to be free from state interference. But you could ask, well, why not just force the education? We would assume that people won't abandon their kids. Parents would hopefully not punish children for receiving compulsory education or alienate them because the state imposes lessons that they do not approve of. But still, just look at the time a little bit. Okay. The relationships we are discussing are not at risk. Broken relationships, as is usually the case, we are discussing when discussing imposition of state demands. Here, we are discussing mostly, functioning, loving, good enough caregiving relationships. These parents are committed to raising children in accordance with their particular visions. These are not parents making selfish choices on their behalf. This is their vision of what is good for their children. It is important to preserve that intimacy and devotion to these relationships and to foster the care that they provide. Even if we keep in mind the importance of being able to eventually exit these relationships, a child must be raised and nurtured by caring adults in order to facilitate free choices and rational decision making. It is the stability and health of these foundational relationships that allow children to mature and act independently upon maturity. Moreover, state interference and undermining of parental authority could harm parenting relationships and, by extension, the child. Parents are likely to flee the state or attempt to undermine the law, which can result in legal penalties. Certainly, both consequences are not good for a child's relationship with a parent or the community or the state. Moreover, the state coming between parent and child and dictating behaviors may strain the relationship if a parent has a particular worldview and wants to raise the child according to that view. The state stepping in and preventing, prohibiting, constrain bonds, particularly when the worldview reflects deeply held beliefs, religious or otherwise. The state acts to put space between parent and child and especially can weaken the bonds between them. Finally, the interference can create parental insecurity and uncertainty and negatively affect parenting behaviors and parenting security. The simple act of interference affects the nature of the relationship and it can undermine parental decision making. Children may feel that they know more or better than their parents, and this can weaken parental control. Studies demonstrate that children who cannot be disciplined by parents can suffer consequences later. Ultimately, we must also ask, is it even pragmatic to force education without support of parents? How do we do that? Without parental cooperation, the impact of imposed education may not be fruitful. Some education perhaps must be forced at some level. We're not saying nothing, but not enough necessarily to secure the right to education that we're talking about. We believe that no matter what, gaps will remain. Okay, I think this is my last slide. And then we'll hear from Ayelet. Okay, so what I'm describing is a clash of rights in children's rights. On the one hand, the right of the child to an education, which would require state imposition. And the other hand, children's right to privacy to be raised by children. These clashes in children's rights are common because there are basically at least 3 strands of rights in the CRC. And when we talk about children's rights, the first are children's civil rights or participation rights, rights that focus on the child and the child's voice. The second is the right to be raised by children and be given parental discretion rights. And the third is rights that involve state intervention, whether there's abuse and neglect or to save them from bodily harm, the rights that depends on state intervention. And these 3 focal points can actually be seen in this tension, not necessarily, can actually be seen in the CRC's description of the right to education. Whereas Article 28 discusses compulsory primary school education, and Article 29 and it's compulsory primary school education and secondary education that should be available. Article 29 discusses universal values that must be promoted in all schools. So it seems like, the CRC is really taking an imposition perspective. But then in Article 29C, sandwiched between 2 provisions that appear to favor state interference, it leans in the opposite direction. This provision says that the education of the child shall be directed to the development and respect of the child's parents, his or her own cultural identity, language, and values. This direction would seem to push toward allowing parents to be more in control of their child's education. And then in Article 30, it specifically states that when ethnic, religious, or linguistic minorities exist, a child belonging to such a minority has a right to her own culture and his own religion. So which is it? Must a child be educated based on universal values? Does the child have the right to be educated based on their own particular family situation? So there's a tension. The CRC tends to totally fog over it. But we know that these 2 kinds of rights conflict, and sometimes children are left without their enough education to fully participate and in society. Ultimately, allowing rights to remain unclear can weaken them. How do we make sense of this tension? We basically take a primarily relational approach on. I'm on the whole thing. Oh,
It's okay.
All right, I'm going to finish. So we take a relational approach. I won't tell you what that is. Ultimately, there is a need to balance. On the one hand, the need for fulfilling the right to education. On the other hand, the right of children to their ongoing supportive relationships. This balance is tricky, especially when children are developing in their dependency.
I'll do it in 5 minutes.
No, do it in.
Oh, it's okay. So we have a solution. Well, at least that's my starting point. That our solution is we have a proposal that requires the state to fulfill its duty to provide education to children later in their life when the conflict between the rights naturally diminishes. And this way we hope to ensure that neither right is sacrificed, but we have a balance over time. So we have to make this move, we make a shift. Instead of focusing just on the conflict of right, we focus on the duties. We adopt and approach the interest theory of rights as interest worthy protection by duties. And of course, if the interest is important enough, it's not just one single duty, but waves of duties. And if one duty cannot fulfill in a certain time, then there are consecutive duties to complete the education when the child matures, and this is why this is not a zero-sum game. So what do we mean by post-majority education? We still have to figure it out, but we are talking about accessible adult education programs, literacy, numeracy, vocational training, digital literacy, financial support for adults, grants, subsidies, flexible learning systems. If we're talking about adults, then their life is different than the lives of children, so it must be flexible, inclusive programs, and they must provide pathways to higher education. Now, of course, the difficult questions, how much time do I have? No, so I know on which 2.5 minutes. Okay, so is it only 18? So, of course, 18 is the threshold because we are talking about post-majority education. But in fact, we ask the question about the conflict, about parental care and education. And the CRC also suggests that as children might mature, they should progressively assume more rights. We have the principle of the evolving capacities. And in Israel, actually, we have the Child Representation Unit in the Ministry of Justice, a lawyer of my own. And if children approach them after the age of 14, they get separate representation. So, of course, if a child is mature enough and the child makes the choice to ask for better education, different education, then the child should get the education. This right should get priority before 18. So this is one question. The other question, well, should there be an upper limit? What happens if an individual has lived comfortably in a traditional community as a Haredi, as an Amish, and experiences a midlife crisis at the age of 40, and suddenly now wants to exercise the right to post-majority education. So, of course, we think there should be a limit and we don't want to impose too heavy burden on the state. Another question we will have to discuss is, well, is the remedy too late? So of course there are basic skills that must be provided when the child is young. We are not discussing the balance. When should the right to parental care prevail? We are talking about the gap. And also, because we are talking about waves of duties and several duties, the state still has a duty to proactively act with the community and try to develop culturally sensitive educational solutions to minimize the gap. So the fact we are addressing the gap doesn't mean we're saying, okay, that's it. It's the only solution, only post-majority education. And I will just say one thing that we will also discuss, because we can think of the right to post-majority education in other situations, war, pandemic, but still it's different. And we explain in our draft article why we focus on this situation and not these other types of conflict. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. I'm pleased to invite Dr. Noy Naaman.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for those who stay with us. So today I want to speak about a very initial thought that I want to develop this year, at the center where I serve as a fellow at the Center of Children's Rights and Youth. And I want to speak about queer youth in school in the US, especially in this shifting political landscape that we see today. So while we have seen significant progress in the context of LGBTQ rights for adults, in different contexts, marriage, adoption, parenthood, over the recent years, we've seen a wave of laws that targeting queer children, especially in school setting. Many of these laws, some of which I will present now, remain highly contested, and I guess that we might have different views about it, whether it's desirable, whether it's not. But what is clear is that this political moment is deeply complicated for queer youth, situating them in vulnerable position, especially in school setting. And I want to take advantage of this harsh moment and to consider actually what opportunities this moment might present for queer youth. In a way, I'm trying to offer a reparative reading of Sidgwick from queer theory for this shifting political landscape. But let's start with briefly with what we know about this, laws. So, anti-LGBTQ attitude and education are not new. We have them since the 80s, but what we have seen in the last 3 years is a sharp rise in policies that directly affected queer students. For example, 8 states that require schools to remove LGBTQ content from curricula, libraries, materials. 7 states that require advanced parental notification of any LGBT curriculum and allows parents to opt out their children if they want. We also see some states that requires parental notification or writing consent for students to use names or pronouns that differ from their sex assigned at birth. And this trend is not limited to the US. It's even crossed into Canada. In 2023, Saskatchewan adopted a similar policy, and Alberta followed it into 2024, requiring parental consent for students under 16 in school setting. So there are several tensions around these debates, and what I want to argue that these tensions are not unique to queer children. They actually have been exist for years, but what the queer context allows us to see how these tensions are more visible, harder to dismiss, and push us to reconsider them. And I would like to think about this tension using the familiar parent-child state triangle, and each corner of the triangle highlights a specific tension, and the connection between them reflect the interconnected nature of this debate. So let's start with the child. So the tension that arises with the child is the tension between autonomy and paternalism. Children is often seen as a process of becoming adult. So on the one hand, we often see children as not yet capable of making fully independent decisions, which lead to more paternalistic measures. But on the other hand, we want to encourage them to engage with diverse views and develop critical thinking about, to help them to grow independent. At the end of the day, we want them to be responsible citizens. And this dialectic balance between paternalism to autonomy and autonomy becomes especially tangible when it comes to sexual and gender identities, which children's self-exploration might be restricted under the gaze of protection. So both the law that censor LGBTQ content in school and the pronouns law are often justified by the belief that exploring desires or explorations outside the heteronormative ideals should be deferred until they become adults. And the assumption is that this form of self-exploration imposes a threat on the children, moral developments, potentially making them engage in same-sex desire or non-confirming gender behaviors. So Professor Clifford Drosky has described this anxiety as the fear of the queer child. And when it comes to the parents, there is often an assumption that the interests of the child align with the interests of the parents, and we traditionally believe that parents act in their children's best interest. But sometimes, maybe despite their love, or maybe because of it, parents can struggle to see how their child needs might differ from their own. And again, this concern becomes particularly crucial in exceptional cases, such those arising in child custody or disputes around the child, or instance where the child is abused, where state intervention is more clearly justified. However, structural misalignment between the interests of the parents and the child can be subtler, indirect in other cases, such the case involving queer youth, where parents might prioritize certain views over their child's authentic identity and self-exploration. And to see the problem, let's look at the policy that requires school to notify parents when a child asks to change their name, change their pronouns, under the plausible justification that we have in constitutional law that we need to respect the parental authority. Yet we know that some children might be situated in an emotional or even physical harm resulting in this policy. We know that high rate of homelessness and isolation among this group of children highlight these tangible consequences of this conflict. And this raises the question of who is best placed to serve the child here? The parents, the child, or maybe someone else? So that may take me to the left corner of the triangle, the state. So the state's responsibility to take care of the child is grounded in the historical doctrine of the parens patriae, literally parents of the country. Historically, this is the doctrine allowed the state to intervene in family issues to protect child well-being, particularly in cases of abuse or neglect. Over time, this authority has expanded to include oversight of children education, enabling the state to establish educational standards and curriculum aimed at promoting social welfare. But what some people see as crucial for preparing children for this democratic life, others view as indoctrination, as a violation of their parents' right to raise their children according to what they believe. And we see this debate actually especially pronounced in the judicial cases around how to integrate LGBTQ inclusive curriculum, particularly in cases where parents are not given the option to opt their children out of these lessons. The state usually argues that permitting opting out for many of these classes can simply undermine the role of education in promoting shared social values and preferring students to engage in this democratic process. So what we do with this? So if we dive into the advocacy and litigations over the recent years, we can identify two theoretical approaches that have been used to sort of deal with these issues. The first one is no promo hetero, which was dubbed by the sociologist Lisa Dagan and then developed by the professor Clifford Roski. And this approach draws very much on the core liberal ideals that the state obligation to remain neutral on issues around sexual orientation and gender identity. And according to this approach, the state should avoid restricting childhood expression of same-sex desire or gender nonconformity. And the strength of this approach lies first in its ability to easily integrate it into existing legal framework that we have in constitutional law, such as the equal protection, which actually has been effective in issues around LGBTQ community. And under this doctrine, explicit state disencouragement or specific gender identity constitute unlawful discrimination on the basis of sex. And indeed, this approach has been effective in challenging the state laws such as of Utah and more recently in Florida, which have prohibited supportive expression of LGBT topics in school curriculum and also in student groups. However, one of the drawbacks of this approach is that it's simply not enough. It simply is not enough to address the underlying structure and hostility, I would say, faced by LGBTQ youth in schools, evidenced by high rate of bullying against them. School for these students is supposed to be one of the most safe space for them, especially if they are not accepted at home. And in some cases, these groups seek not just universal roles, but also tailored protection, accommodation, designed specifically to address their unique challenges and vulnerability. Which takes me to the second approach, multiculturalism. According to this approach, the state should not just tolerate, yes, I'm there, tolerate minority groups that are vulnerable to marginalization. It should actively protect their collective interests by emphasizing their cultural differences. So it's not only a group that want to be protected, it's a groups that are vulnerable to be marginalized. And I think that queer youth make a strong case for considering this approach, unlike other minority groups, and I don't want to hierarchize them, but I think queer youth has a special characteristic here because they cannot learn about their culture through their families. Queer youth don't have this kind of support at home, many of them at least. And I think that school can step in here. It can give queer students the opportunities to explore of their culture and identities that they might need to offer, and to recognize that not all children receive the same supports or opportunity to explore these future possibilities. So this approach might be seen as idealistic, but it's actually already been put into action. If we look at California, which was the first in the FAIR Act in 2011, followed by New Jersey, and more recently Nevada, which requires schools to teach history and social science in a way that accurately represent LGBT students and their identities alongside those of other minority groups based on nation, race, etc. I'm skeptical here. I think that it's wonderful, but for one, there's several problems. First, these multicultural ideals have been used throughout history to actually restrict LGBTQ rights. We see this in the marriage cases. So I'm not sure this is the best strategic way to deal with it. Second, I'm not sure that I put LGBTQ in curriculum will change. It's enough. The deeper and maybe it's a start, but I'm not sure this is the end game. And third, I'm not sure that the state is the best to frame the meaning of identities. One, because the complicated relationship between the LGBTQ community and the state. And two, because maybe we don't want to articulate identity up-bottom, but maybe bottom-up. And this takes me to the third approach. So Catherine Bond Stockton, in her influential book, The Queer Child, suggests that all children are queer. And by saying that, she doesn't mean that every child is a trans or gay, but she pushes us to invite us to recognize the inherent queerness, strangeness of childhood, at least from the perspective of the adult, the unexpected and the resistance of the normative path that adults expect to follow them. So this might lead to the same outcome like the second approach, which is to recognize diverse identities. However, I think what makes this approach distinct is its motivation. It's not primarily about recognizing fixed identity. It's not about sorting the children to pre-existing categories. It's about embracing the dynamic, unfolding nature of self-exploration and acknowledging the many versions of being a child. It's about becoming and being. And to make it less abstract, I think that the seeds of these ideas already planted in some of the legal frameworks. One example is the way Professor Noam Pelex offered to recognize the right to develop, and which is based and grounded on the Professor Emily Bass we just have heard, recognize the evolving agency and their capacity to shape their own future, leaving a broader space for them to participate in their growth, to have some mistakes, but to participate in the growth on their own term. So bringing the queer sensibility, which emphasizes the unexpected continuous process of self-exploration and identity formation, into the conversation with the scholarly, quite new recent scholarly discussions on the right to development, might open space to envision a responsive understanding of childhood in general and in school in this harsh political invasion in landscape. And such understanding will not only benefit students who are identified or might identify as queer, but also open up possibilities for all students to consider what queer could broadly mean. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Noah, and I'm pleased to invite Tanya Hassan.
Hi, thank you everyone for making it to this late hour of the day. There's dinner afterwards, so that's helpful. So I'm going to be presenting on a study I'm doing together with Dr. Gal Levy and Dr. Muhammad Masalha from the Open University of Israel. And we're going to show some initial findings from a study that we did about the role of school in students' political socialization and activism in times of socio-political crisis and beyond. Wow, that's a mouthful, but I'll try to, yeah. So the context for this, for what we're talking about today, is the Israeli pro-democracy movement. It emerged in January 2023 in response to the Netanyahu government's judicial reform, which opponents quickly labeled a regime change initiative because they argued that it poses significant threat to democratic checks and balances. And so opponents engaged in mass demonstrations and protest actions of different kinds, like roadblocking, marches, sit-ins. And these demonstrations and protest actions were attended by children and young people people of all ages, actually, but also children and young people who attended with their families and with their peers, including through youth-led organizations. The protest halted at the beginning of the Israel-Hamas war in October 2023. They slowly resumed some months later in a different way, but I won't get into that because we did the study shortly after it was until after it was halted. So yeah, it's still ongoing. Just some examples. So here we have on the right a photo from a student protest that they did outside of their school, and they blocked the road for a while. And on the left is a sign from a protest by children and parents, and it says, "I want to grow up in a free country," and it says democracy, democracy, democracy all around it. So just to give you some visuals of how that looked like. Now, if we think about children's activism, so both the sociology of childhood and the children's rights movement recognizes children as socio-political agents. And this is important because their activism is often trivialized or entirely disregarded. Now, recently, there has been more visibility around children's activism, especially around the youth climate strike in Europe and the US. But actually, children have been involved in social movement and protest movements since modernity. And some other examples are the Arab Spring and the US rights movement, but there are many more. If we turn to the UN Convention on the Child of the Rights to look at activism, we have Article 15, which is about the freedom of association, peaceful assembly, which is interesting, the peaceful here. There's also Article 12 with the freedom of expressing views. And if we look at schools, a part of the right to education is the right to be educated about these rights. So when we thought about activism in schools, we thought about citizenship education. Lately, maybe not even that lately, there's a push in policy and subsequently in scholarship as well to push for active citizenship. So to encourage civic engagement and political participation. And this can be done by doing deliberative activities in school, encouraging peer norms, teaching about how to consume the news, and so on. But what's interesting here is that both policies and the scholarship usually focus on outcomes of traditional political participation. So these are things like volunteering or campaign participation or intention to vote. And they don't really engage with the act of protesting, even though this is a really important pillar of democracy. Oh, someone wants to come into the Zoom. I don't know what to do about that. And if we look a bit more to the left, and what's much less common are really maximalist and justice-oriented approaches to citizenship education, which argue that we should teach students how to challenge systems of oppression at the root, and okay, they went away, and engage in non-violent violent resistance. But this is really at the edges. It's not very common, especially not in schools, but even not in scholarships so much. So I'm going to discuss findings from a larger study that started in 2018 that has to do with citizenship education in Israel in the eyes of young people. It included focus groups and interviews with over 91 Jewish and Palestinian youth aged 15 to 24. And today I'm going to show findings, especially from the rounds of interviews and focus groups that we did in 2023 and 2024 in the context of the pro-democracy movements. We had some participants who were actively involved in the movement, some who were previously involved, and some who opposed the movement. But at some points, I am going to juxtapose these findings to findings from earlier rounds to really try to investigate whether and how the role of schools in facilitating activism has changed. So again, these are initial findings, and we'd love any feedback and thinking together as we develop this further. So some participants definitely spoke about how they felt that there's been a change in their schools actively and directly encourage their participation in the protests. And this could come from teachers critiquing the reform and the government, but also staff calling students to go out and protest, and even organizing joint demonstrations of teachers and students together. And they felt that this was something unique. So here Ed is talking about how, says, I'm pretty sure teachers are not allowed to talk about what a problem the reform is. I don't think that's part of the curriculum, right? So they could tell that this was something unique and something that's changed. Now, other schools or even staff in the same schools indirectly encourage participation. So they could do it, for example, by disregarding absences from school that were because some students just missed a lot of schools because they were out protesting, and the teachers just didn't take marks off from that. Some teachers also just discussed the reform and the movement or the topic of democratic checks and balances with their students. And participants also said that they just met their teachers at the protest, so they knew what their teachers were thinking. And here Elon Way is talking about how his teacher really tried to incorporate into the curriculum about the reform and how it connects to things that they learned in civics lessons. Now, participants, whether it was direct or indirect encouragement, participants were really aware that their schools were navigating intense institutional pressures not to deal with this topic and not to oppose the reform. So here Ben is talking about how there was this joint demonstration by teachers and students, but he said it was very politically correct. Like we couldn't say things against specific politicians. We could say we were for democracy or say we're against a specific action that harms democracy. And we can see that there's even lines that the school won't cross, because what happened later was that one of the students had a sign with the Palestinian flag drawn on it, and the teacher tried to physically take it from him. And that, for Ben, was a pretty harsh experience. So there's the things we'll talk about and the things the school won't talk about. Now, if we compare it, and this is not a quantitative study, but if we look at what participants said about their schools before 2023, there were very few schools that encouraged activism, but even more so, most schools didn't even want to deal with political issues. Like here, David is talking about how his school, didn't talk about participation as a citizen in the country. He said, oh, there's student council, and all we talk about is what activities we'll do at recess or where the annual trip will be. And this goes together with studies undertaken from teachers' perspective in Israel in the last few years about how teachers feel that they have to avoid issues that are deemed controversial. And by controversial, we mean those associated with the left, such as human rights and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because they were worried about backlash from students, from parents, from teachers, from the Ministry of Education. And this is very problematic because discussing controversial topics is a really important skill to develop for civic participation. And now when we talk about the role of schools, I want to make it very clear that we don't just mean school staff or don't just mean teachers and management. We also talk about school peers. Because when we talked with activist participants, they spoke about how school for them is a place to engage in political discussions with their peers. And it's a way to influence their peers, to get them to come to the protests as well. So here Nachal is talking about school is the place to start making a change. She was also involved in the youth climate strike, so they did lessons on the climate crisis at schools. And Elizabeth is talking about how they sometimes contrasted it to adults. She was like, oh, at school we could go and hang flyers and talk about these things. We have this platform, and adults don't have that at work, probably. They have to do work. So they saw it as actually some freedom to do things that adults can't do. But you know, it's not all rosy with peers. It also means you have to navigate your activist identity and your politics with your school peers. And so Gadi, for example, was talking about how at school they called him a smelly leftist. And then he kept talking about how, no, it wasn't really offensive. And thank you, he was at a boarding school. He said, we all live together, it's okay. But I'm sure it wasn't a fun experience for him, to say the least. And Naomi talks here about how there's a boy in a class that she's taking that she really, really likes as a person, but he's the polar opposite of her politically. And so she said, once he starts talking, I have to shut down. I don't want to hear it. I don't want to engage with him. It's just too difficult. Yeah, so, and now we have to talk about what kind of schools are we talking about? What kind of youth are we talking about? Which it might not be surprising, but these schools, you know, a lot of the time the activist participants told me, but my school is special. And special, they meant, oh, it could be anthroposophic or have some sort of special designation, but mostly what it means that these are schools of middle to high socioeconomic background. And this was true also for the participants who said that their schools encouraged their activism before. So there were fewer of them, but again, it's the same kind of demographic. And I also want to talk about how this was mostly about Jewish students and participants, because Palestinians as a whole didn't really participate in the protest movement. And we can find some explanation for this also in our earlier rounds of the study, where the Palestinian students, well, they weren't students anymore, but they talked about how in school they felt this dissonance between the rights that they were taught that they supposedly have in Israel and their everyday experiences. So here Basma is talking about how, you know, her teachers taught her that there's freedom of expression, Israel is a democratic country. But she said, but then when I go out and I want to say what I think about Palestine and the land, that right disappears. So we can see also why they were disengaged and didn't really think that protests were a way to make a change, and this protest wasn't really about them or for them. So just to conclude with some concluding thoughts and concluding questions. So we can see that engaging in activism requires complex navigations with school staff and peers and by school staff and by students. And schools can they can play a role in fostering children's agency, rights, and activism, but these are schools from a certain background and they still face significant political pressures. I didn't really get into it, but if you want to ask me about that, I would love to talk about what to do about students who didn't agree with the protest and their schools were advocating for it. So this is definitely something to consider. And I also want to ask if this is an active citizenship education, how radical it is. Because in the end, the protest movement, the pro-democracy movement, it wasn't really necessarily about changing things from the root. It was returning to a certain status quo. And so this is maybe not that radical, but it didn't feel that way to the participants. For the participants, it felt very radical, and especially the actions they were doing were still radical, road blocking, mass demonstrations. So there's even this question of, like, even if the content isn't radical, what they were learning was that radical because of the form. And I'll let Dror say the last words. He's talking about, you know, people think that his generation doesn't care, but his generation actually does care. They care about human rights and the government and financial issues. But he says it's a generation that has been a bit neglected in the aspects of education and citizenship. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tavia. And I have the pleasure of inviting last but certainly not least, Dr. Haley Mudrik Even.
So, good evening. Okay, can you hear me? No. Everyone, and thank you for inviting me for this very interesting conference, and thank you for letting me close this first day. Hope it would be worth. And anyway, so I'm going to present this paper that is actually not a work in progress. It has already been published, but still I would welcome your comments. And I'm an international legal scholar, and so it's a research that is done from that perspective. So I'm going to talk about restoring children's right to education during and after war through the Ukrainian case study. Okay. Yes. So as this war was actually an expression of what you can see here in the UNICEF statement that has been made on the 100th day of the war, which was also the International Day for the Protection of Children. So this actual acute child protection crisis has made me think about, among the other violations of children's rights, about the violation of the right to education during war and how it can be redressed. There against me. ככה זה יעבוד? לא, כלום לא עובד. אבל זה לא סולק, זה גם לא פה.
זה לא עבד, נכון?
קרה לי לפני איזה...
לעצור את הזמן.
כן, לפני איזה יותר מ10 שנים באום, ודיברתי בלי מצגת, והם היו כל כך, וואו, איך עשיתי את זה?
אנחנו גם מאוד נתרשם. אוקיי,
טכנולוגיה מאוד מתקדמת.
זה עובד. בינתיים.
עובד שאת עושה.
מה אני?
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So what is the purpose of this presentation? First, I would like to examine the right to education during and after war and how it can be redressed. I mean, not first, this would be the whole purpose of the presentation. And I would offer recommendations of what the international community can actually do for this purpose. I would, as I said, use the Ukrainian case study as an example. And then my original proposal would be to suggest a mechanism that would involve 3 factors. This would be the CRC committee and states parties to the CRC, and then a trust fund that is actually would be established according to a model of existing UN trust funds, and that I will tell you about it later. Okay, so a very brief background about how the international community has begun even to consider the rights of children during war. I guess maybe most of you here know about the Groucho Machel report in 1996 that was actually a turning point for the international community, according to which it was prompted to take action against the violations of children's rights in war. And there were various developments that followed this report, and of course the establishment of the office of the Special Representative for the Secretary General on Children in Armed Conflict, and then a series of UN Security Council resolutions on the subject, and then a Security Council mandated monitoring and reporting mechanism. And in the end, we all know about this huge network of agencies and offices and funds that actually fight against violations of children's generally, and of course also during armed conflicts. And you can see just very few of them here. And the legal protection of children in armed conflict is in fact regulated by these various legal branches of international law, basically international human rights law, international humanitarian law, refugee law, international criminal law, and of course other UN treaties that are related to the protection of children. I'm not going to review all of them, and I'm going to speak mainly about international human rights law and international humanitarian law, and even this I will do very briefly. Okay, so of course the right to education was firstly enshrined by the UDHR of 1948, and then it is also a central focus of UNESCO conventions, and of course, it is a widely accepted right that was endorsed with minimum reservations by state parties to human rights treaties, and also in the CRC, and this is something that you all know. So, and again, the CRC is again one of the most ratified human rights instruments, although it was not ratified by the United States, as we heard previously today. And also the CRC is something that you're familiar with, so maybe I would just mention its importance as a holistic document and the fact that it is founded on 4 grounding principles, and all of them I have considered when I thought about the mechanism that I would present to you today. Okay, and I do want to talk a little bit about Article 28 that was also mentioned by Pamela before. which expresses in a sense an unequivocal consensus about the right to education. But I would focus later on a sub-article of Article 28 that actually, I think, expresses a kind of sort of solidarity right. And I would explain later why I see it as a solidarity right. And we also have to focus here on Article 38, that is the only article that relates to the protection of children during armed conflict, and that requires state parties to undertake and respect and to ensure respect for the rules of IHL relevant to the child, and take all feasible measures to ensure protection and care of children who are affected by armed conflict. The CRC committee has also a very rigorous monitoring mechanism, and I know that you're aware of it, but it's important for my suggested proposal, so this is why I'm focusing on it. And of course, you're familiar with the process of states submitting their reports, and then the committee that submits its own reports, the COs. It is highly esteemed for its expertise and its active leadership role in monitoring the implementation of the CRC, and of course in providing guidance to states parties. And it is also considered as a human rights treaty that has more effect than other treaties in some countries and actually in many countries. So there are strengths to the monitoring process, and we can witness the gradual improvement in states' reports, and then the practical achievements in the CRC monitoring committee process, especially when we compare it to other human rights treaties. But we can also speak about the disadvantages or the challenges. First, the word count limit for the COs, and then that outside this monitoring mechanism, the CRC has not really established any robust follow-up on the procedure. And basically, after all, it is very much contingent upon states' willingness and goodwill to apply or implement the recommendations that are made in the COs. Okay. And so, yes, Article 4 actually is the article that articulates how states should implement their obligations in the CRC. And as I said, Article 28.3 calls states parties to cooperate in matters relating to education. So this is why it is portrayed as a solidarity right or a solidarity mechanism. Also underscores the needs of developing countries and makes some kind of a suggestion that richer countries will support poorer countries in facilitating the right to, making accessible the right to education to children in developing countries. And this was crucial for my proposal, which I really hope I would have time. Still, okay. So now I have to talk about the protection of children in armed conflict. The protection of the right to education in armed conflict. And this is undertaken by various instruments of IHL, the Geneva Convention, the additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions of 1977, and then also, the guiding principles here are the obligations of occupying powers, and also the principle of distinction, which is very crucial here because it requires states to avoid attacking objectives which are not military, among them, of course, schools. And then also the requirement of state parties to provide care and help to children, even when they flee their countries, and to continue being eligible to receive their religious and moral education. Yeah. So now let's go to the Ukrainian case study. Now I have 5 minutes. Okay. So Ukraine ratified the CRC already in 1991, and actually, and it has a formal legal status in Ukraine. So it was something to work with. The CRC monitoring committee could work with the fact that the CRC has a formal legal status in Ukraine. And in general, actually, Ukraine has or had a relatively good record of following up on the recommendations that were made in the COs. In 2017, there was a reform in the education system of Ukraine. And when the war began, later on in October 2022, there was a report that was issued by the CRC committee in which it actually commended Ukraine for the progress that it achieved in this realm. And yet, of course, it also mentioned the challenges and the fact that Ukraine was still facing challenges in protecting educational facilities from attack in accordance with the Safe Schools Declaration, a non-binding declaration, and still Ukraine endorsed this declaration. By the way, Russia has not. Not that it, of course, exempts it from its obligations under binding international law. So what we can see is that Ukraine has taken significant steps to follow up on the recommendations that were made by the CRC, and yet, of course, back then we could assume that it would slow down its ability to fulfill the recommendations, and this is exactly what happened. So, what do we make of it? So I will skip that, and I will and I will now go on and describe my proposed mechanism for redressing the right to education. So, for that, I would like to say that it is understood that it would be very costly to rehabilitate and to redress the right to education in Ukraine, and there were several NGOs that were committed to this task. Also, the EU and the World Bank suggested sums of, significant sums that could be used for redressing the right to education. But then I thought that this is such a basic right, and it could not be left to the goodwill of as many NGOs as exist. And I think it should be a task that should be entrusted with states. And so this is why I thought of the following idea. So the problem, as I said, is that the CRC monitoring and implementation mechanism is not sufficient because securing the dischargement of states' obligations in human rights treaties is usually an Achilles heel. Because, as I said, it actually depends on the goodwill of states. And usually it is contingent on some kind of an incentive for states, any incentive, economic or political influence or political gain to follow up on human rights treaties obligations. And I think that the CRC monitoring process that does not offer a sufficient incentive. So this is why I think that the CRC committee monitoring process is not enough. And what could be done then? Yeah, yes, I know. So, as I said, I'm suggesting a mechanism that would be based on collaboration between three factors: states and two institutions, a trust fund that would redress children's right to education during and after armed conflict, and the CRC committee. And I think it can be regulated by an optional protocol to the CRC. And the trust fund would be established according to a model of two other existing UN trust funds. It would also be different from them in some respects. As this trust fund, these other trust funds, it could be managed by a board of trustees and an independent secretariat. But differing from this trust fund is the identity of the contributors. While the trust funds actually count on external contributors, here I think that state parties to this optional protocol and state parties to the CRC should be contributing to, I'm just finishing, to the trust fund, and then in times of need, states could use this trust fund, but only if they show a good record of following up with former CO's concluding observations, recommendations. So this would give them incentive to follow up on their recommendations, and then they could be eligible to use the funds. So I think this would be the conclusion. The conclusion would be that, as we have seen, the taking care of children in armed conflict is a fertile industry, and yet the CRC monitoring committee that has been involved in this process is not suggesting a sufficient model. I think states themselves that have been somehow pushed back should come to the front of the stage and take an active role in this protection. And I think that the mechanism that I have suggested offers an incentive for states to participate in this mechanism and then to be eligible to use the funds. And I think that the ones who would benefit from this suggestion would, of course, be the children after all. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Hey, thank you very much. Thanks to all 6 speakers. We have time for one question. 5 minutes, so maybe even more than one. Yes, please.
I have a question for Talia. And I understand that, and I agree with your point that it's important to discuss controversial political issues in schools. Okay, thank you. But isn't it critical that the students should hear both sides of the argument and they should get objectively accurate information? If we leave it just to the teacher and he can tell them according to his own views, that isn't going to happen. So what do you suggest to ensure that the students are getting objective information and hearing both sides of the argument?
I think mine is more like a suggestion to Talia. I think when we were talking about the citizen participation and activism, you were focusing on education, but it appears your focus is more on formal education without thinking about informal education, what happened at the homes in terms of what is the contribution of the community and family in terms of this. Then Dr. Naman, yes, I think there's a theory that you pointed to that childhood is inherently queer. I think there's also research that suggests that there is no scientific evidence that people are born with those tendencies. So maybe you may have to check out that particular research. Since you are looking at recent trends concerning the issue that you were talking about.
Thank you very much. A third and perhaps final question.
Thank you for your question. Thank you, everyone. This is so fascinating. I'm glad to sit with all of you in this panel. It is a good question of showing them both sides. And I think
Maybe I did a bit of a disservice, but only because of lack of time. So there was definitely some participants that said, well, one of them was like, our principal told us, go demonstrate. Doesn't matter for, against, just go demonstrate. So there was definitely some teachers that showed a more balanced side. And I mentioned the teacher that spoke about the reform and why people are protesting. So I think that's also more balanced. I think worrying teachers are teaching or indoctrinate. I mean, that's happening anyway, right? I think it's much more important to be clear about how and why. And some of the participants said, well, my school is this liberal school, is a lefty school, so we would expect schools like that to act for the reform. But definitely the participants as students were very concerned about these issues and what to do. And some of them said, and I didn't get into it because of time, but some of them had teachers who were very aggressively for the protests, and they felt uncomfortable with that because they didn't think about the students who didn't agree, and they were also thinking about how they didn't all want to engage in controversial issues, as I've shown, and some of them were worried about that. They were thinking about how to create this school climate. So it's definitely a dilemma. I don't have answers for that, but I'll keep thinking about it. Thank you. And as for, I totally agree about the family. Today I just focused on school, but if we're going according to the ecological model of participation, I think what's important about the participants who are activists is they were actually not just the schools that were supporting, it was their peers, it was the youth movement, part of, it's very parts of the really engage in this thing, especially for children, because we don't really like protesting and all of that. So school is just one part of it, but definitely goes into all different sorts of factors. Thank you.
So thank you for your question. If I understand correctly, you ask me if it's about scientific or not. Yeah. Yeah.
Positing that a child who is inherently queer, and I was saying that I will also consider the scientific perspective that there is no a scientifically proved tendency that children have those tendencies.
Okay, I see your point. So
I was saying that maybe we may have to reconcile those new trends with those scientific also information that have been put out.
So it's just about scientific. It's more about how we think about queerness. Queerness, it's not necessarily about whether the child is gay or trans. It's about a sensibility to explore his identity formation, which might not be meets what we as adults expected. And it's less scientific grounded and more conceptually grounded how we want to think about childhood, not from a pre-categories that we want to assign them, but more in a way that maybe growing to the side, maybe growing and do mistakes. And this is about queerness. So I think how we can reconcile whether it's scientific or not, it's how we identify what is queer. And this is what I want to push for.
I get you perfectly. You were saying that the current position is saying that they are born inherently, childhood is inherently have those tendencies. And I'm saying that the other study that also says that there is no scientific basis to say that such tendencies exist within children. So I was just inviting you to reconcile those new trends with also what the scientific evidence also suggests. So it's more like an invitation.
I like that you push me, because this is exactly the point that I want to grappling with between the science and the humanities, maybe. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you all join me and give a round of applause to all 6 presenters? And to the audience who's made it through to the very end of a very intense day.
Okay, so thank you everyone for this wonderful day, for the wonderful presentations, the beautiful slides, especially the Canva ones, and for being so wonderfully punctual and on time. Thank you very much again.